We are born free, and we will die free. The time in between, though, that's complicated. In that time, governments, institutions, and our egos will limit our ability to find true freedom in this life. These are real stories of real people overcoming the odds, persevering in justice, and unlocking their potential. Welcome to Finding Freedom. Here's your host, John Odermatt.
Welcome in to another edition of Finding Freedom right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. And ladies and gentlemen, have an awesome show for you guys today. Something very near and dear to my heart. Really something near and dear to what set me off along this path, down this path of podcasting and talking about criminal justice reform. And something that I think is very important to be able to create the cultural change necessary to really end the stigma that we have for formerly incarcerated individuals, for felons, for people who have been to prison, for getting them back in society and working. And that, of course, is, normalizing formerly incarcerated people in the workplace and taking advantage and using their skills so they're able to add value to society. So I got a great guest today who has written an awesome book talking about that exact same thing, and not only about the moral argument why that should be done, but the utilitarian argument and backing it up with the data to show that it is the only way and really the best way, and that it's necessary because so many people have been to prison in our ridiculous mass incarceration system that we have here in the United States, that if we don't do this, if we don't normalize felons and the formerly incarcerated in the workplace, then we're not going to have enough people to work and to create things and to get the economy going. So excited for this interview, guys. Let's not waste any more time and get right into it. Okay, my guest today on Finding Freedom is Jeff Korzenik. He is the Chief Investment Strategist for one of the nation's largest banks, where he's responsible for investment strategy and the allocation of over $40 billion in assets. For more than 30 years, Jeff has been known in the investment management industry for the clarity and originality he brings to complex challenges. He's a regular guest on CNBC, Fox Business News, Bloomberg for his insights into the economy, markets, manufacturing, and the workforce. Jeff's writings on economics and public policy have been published in Barron's, Forbes, the Chicago Tribune, and many other periodicals. He's testified on Capitol Hill as an expert witness on the use of commodity indexes by pensions and other institutional investors. And today, he is here on Finding Freedom to talk about his new book, which is very relevant to my show with how passionate I am about criminal justice reform. His book is called Untapped Talent: How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and the Community. Jeff, welcome to Finding Freedom.
Thanks so much, John. Great to be with you.
Great to have you on the show, Jeff. And before we get into talking about your book, I think it's interesting. I think the angle which you've attacked this subject from an economic perspective. But before we get into that and talk about the book, maybe you can talk about your background and how you got interested in business and economics and investments and how you found your way down this path.
Well, I've always had a passion for it. I was one of those guys who in college subscribed to the Wall Street Journal and read it faithfully every day, and just grew up with a fairly traditional investment management background. The only way it's non-traditional is I started out on the commodity side. So gradually made my way over to more traditional investments and have been in my current role for 11 years, and just one of these people who loves unlocking and solving the puzzles that are presented every day by the economy.
Yeah, and one of the biggest puzzles, well, we have a lot of puzzles right now in the economy, and your book addresses two of them, or I guess maybe more than that, but two I think of primarily being the labor shortage and we have a problem with finding proper employment for the formerly incarcerated. So you start out talking about that first issue, the labor shortage, which I think you published this book in April, right? And really every day that goes by here, we see more of an impact right now from this labor shortage. So I'm just kind of curious to get your take on just what's happening currently today with the labor shortage.
Sure. There's this long-term backdrop, which is largely demographic. We are not replacing our population. We're heading to a labor shortage just based on birth patterns and fertility patterns in the United States. But it's absolutely been exacerbated by the pandemic. The pandemic is this great disruptor of economic trends. When people's work is disrupted, they have trouble. They get kicked out of the workforce. They have trouble getting back in the workforce. We've had changes in geographic trends, industry trends, all sorts of things that are really causing a lot of disruption in the labor force, compounded by government policies that are holding people back from making some of the really tough decisions. And all of that is adding up to a really surprisingly tough labor shortage at this level of recovery in the economy.
So do you see, I get what you're saying long term with fertility rates dropping, leading to one of the factors leading to a labor shortage long term. But just in the short term, I'm curious to get your opinion. What do you see happening in the next maybe 2 to 5 years here? Is this something that's going to get worse in the short term and then get a little better, and then over the long term get worse, or is that asking too much to predict all that?
Well, I'm gonna divide that up into demand for labor and supply for labor.
Okay.
Demand for labor is absolutely coming back, and it's coming back at a really robust pace. There's a wall of cash that has been, or a mountain of cash that has been built up as a result of all the fiscal stimulus, as well as simply the inability to go out and spend on travel and entertainment and things like that during the lockdown portion of the pandemic. So that cash is about to be unleashed, or is already being unleashed, and that's causing a demand for goods and services, which means a demand for labor. The supply issue is trickier. We hurt our supply of labor. If you look at measurements like labor force participation rates, after a couple of years of recovery leading up to 2020, during the pandemic, a lot of people have just dropped out of the labor force. Mm-hmm. And I do believe they're coming back over the next couple of years, but I don't think they are going to come back to the old highs very easily. We have lost a lot of older workers who had stayed in the workforce, and I don't think they're coming back. We've lost some women, predominantly women, some men, who've dropped out to watch over children, particularly when schools were physically closed. Many will come back, but I think some won't come back. And we don't have the wave of millennials coming into the labor force anymore. So I think we are in for the start of this long-term labor shortage will become very evident. To the degree it's evident already, it's going to get much worse next year.
Yeah. It's everywhere I go, I see signs for people hiring, and you see, especially in the restaurant industry, it seems like, which I think that's probably more of a short-term thing. I kind of have a theory that people got this stimulus cash, and they feel like they're rich, and then a couple months from now, they'll probably be out looking to fill those jobs.
Right, and the supplemental unemployment benefits, which run out in September, and some states are already backing out. I think that'll address some of it, but there's some real problems. I mean, think of I think it's a pretty good bet that we won't have as many department store jobs as we had prior to the pandemic, and we're going to have more Amazon warehouse jobs. Mm-hmm. So, you might say one for one, it's not a real problem, but is the person who worked at a department store for 20 years now going to be the person to go fill that job at an Amazon warehouse? Some cases, yes, but a lot of cases, no. And those kind of mismatches are very destructive to labor force participation. There's one other point I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. We also have a new Fed policy, and this our Federal Reserve, our central bank's new monetary policy framework, as they're calling it, calls for running red hot labor markets. And that's something that the business community has never really had to deal with. Every time labor markets got hot, that got to be about the end of the cycle. And sooner or later, the Fed would raise interest rates, slow the economy, and you didn't have to worry about your labor shortage. The Fed is very intentionally trying to keep labor markets hot for years to come. That's a new challenge for the business community.
When you say keep labor markets hot, what do you exactly mean by that?
Well, one measure is prior to the pandemic, we were looking at a common measurement, looking at the ratio of job openings to job seekers. And prior to the pandemic, for a period of nearly 2 years, which was unprecedented, we saw more job openings than job seekers. That's kind of definition of a hot labor market. The Fed wants to go back to those days, perhaps not to that exact measurement, but they were very focused on the power of employment to address some social ills. And so they want to see what they're calling broad-based and inclusive employment. And no one's really sure how they're measuring it, but Fed Chair Powell has referenced, say, African-American unemployment rates versus white unemployment rates. And those rates of unemployment had been narrowing prior to the pandemic, shot back up. I think there's a desire on the Fed's part to create conditions that are conducive to addressing those inequalities.
Well, that's an interesting conversation. We could save that for another day. But
it's a lot of fine tuning.
Yeah.
It's really the decent economic history. Labor markets get hotter. People come in off the sidelines. Frankly, in my work with second chance hiring, I've seen the business community respond to tight labor markets by becoming more interested in trying to explore reaching out to these marginalized labor forces.
Right.
So to focus in on really the aspect of the book Second Chance Hiring, what's driving that? Not only the issue of there being this glut of people formerly incarcerated who are underemployed or unemployed, but that glut of people can meet this need. So what really motivated you to tackle that?
Sure. I started getting interested in this in 2013, 2014, when a big topic among people who follow the economy was why we were missing people from the labor force. And as I looked into it more and more, I started to realize that we had an opportunity to bring people on off the sidelines from this population of people who've been marginalized by virtue of interaction with the criminal justice system. And I fortunately stumbled across employers who had figured out a very successful way to make this a business proposition and investment, not a charitable act. But there was a very specific way to do it. And I started talking about this, sharing the information I had learned with our business customers around the country. And I got to the point where I simply needed to leverage my time. So 2019, I did 141 flight segments. I couldn't travel more. I also find businesses would be interested by hearing me speak, but they needed more in-depth tools in which to actually implement it. And they also needed the credibility of a book and written cases in order to combat some of the internal inertia and objections that they faced. So a book became the pathway to solving all of those issues.
So with regards to second chance hiring, obviously a big piece of that is the United States has this massive over-incarceration problem. And you talk about that in the book. Can you just, there's a lot of factors that drive that, but some of the main drivers for that over-incarceration.
Sure. I mean, starting in the 70s and 80s, it started in many ways as a response to rising inner city crime in the late 60s and into the 70s. It was a response to drugs and the quote unquote war on drugs. And then we kind of stumbled along and it became just a bad system where public prosecutors became incented to get as many convictions of the highest crimes they could because that furthered their careers. And I don't think there's all this malicious intent that some people ascribe to criminal justice system. I specifically reference in the book a saying, an aphorism called Hanson's razor, which says, "Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity." And what we've been left with after all these decades is a really stupid criminal justice system, one that doesn't promote public safety and doesn't promote better communities. So that to me is where we've ended up. I don't like to get into saying who's responsible, but that's where we are, and we certainly can do better.
Yeah, and that's something I like to remind people of. And we were talking before the show about how this show used to be called Felony Friday with a primary focus on interviewing people who've been to prison. And, something that one of the main complaints that they have, probably maybe not the biggest, but it's consistent across the board, is that transition, that reentry, being able to gather the skills needed to actually get back into society and add value. There's just so many obstacles in place that it's impossible for a lot of people. So to me, that's a huge obstacle that I see, and you do talk about that in the book. So can you go through some of the ways that either companies or nonprofits and these other helpers that you've seen, how they can ease that problem?
Sure. And this is something that actually where government can do a better job too, and not focus as exclusively in incarceration on punishment and sequestration of people from society. I think many prison systems are starting to understand that part of their role, if their role is truly to promote justice and public safety, they should be equipping people better to get out the gates. But that's not universally true. As your listeners may know, we have a very fragmented prison system. There's the federal system, but that's a fairly small part of the prison population. You really have 50 different systems, the state by state systems. And some do a good job, some do a terrible job, and even guts down to the facility. So nonprofits have played this really critical role in helping people get back on their feet. And it might be soft skills training, basic technology training, so people can actually apply for a job in our digital age, helping people further their education, critical things like just regaining your IDs that may have expired while you were in prison, housing, transportation. There's just this whole host of obstacles that people who exit incarceration face that are poorly understood, I think, by the business community.
Yeah, I think it's poorly understood by everyone. And on top of all of that, there's just the stigma that's attached to it.
Absolutely.
Innocent or guilty. A lot of people forget that most people, the vast majority who go to prison, everyone's going to get out of prison eventually.
Right,
and
95%. Absolutely.
Whether you agree or disagree with what they did, they're going to get back into society, and to have an attitude that you don't think that they should be able to integrate fully and provide some value to society, that's only making it more of a public safety issue, because that's going to drive them back into maybe some of the dangerous and potentially violent things that they were doing before. So we talked about reentry, and the next step after that, once they do get hired, you kind of went through some different models of how companies hire felons and how they are used in the workforce. So
right.
Can you talk about those different models, ones that work well and ones that really don't work so well?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. For me, this was sort of a breakthrough section, because I learned from all these companies that do it right and have this great model that, yes, requires an investment of time and sometimes some money and accommodation, but returns a great employee, someone who's very dedicated and very loyal, and that means boils down to profitable. But as I started to talk about this in the business community, business owners and executives would be coming up to me and saying, "Oh no, I hired them and it didn't work that way." And as I dug down, I came to understand that many people in the business community have tried it, but had a negative experience and don't want to try it again. So the challenge became understanding and communicating that the problem was not the population of people with records, but was the process and the models they followed. So the most common model I would guess out there is what I call the disposable employee model. And this might be, a low-end fast food restaurant, or it might be people in different kinds of maintenance or sanitation type businesses where the job skills are fairly low. And there's not a lot of training that goes on, and what you need is a body there. And so the business model is, how can you get the cheapest body possible? And if you hire people who've exited incarceration, there may be a tax credit, the work opportunity tax credit, that lasts for a certain period of time. And, if they stay past that, fine. If they don't, it doesn't matter. You just got a cheap employee. And that's a case of, you get what you pay for, right? You're not terribly selective in the model. You're not terribly supportive of someone's career. And so you have high turnover. It probably works on a short-term basis. I don't think it will work if we get into a labor shortage and people have other alternatives. I don't condemn it. I mean, at least it's a chance for someone who would not have, might not otherwise have a chance. The more common problematic model was what I call the undifferentiated model. And this is a traditional business approach. You have your model of supporting employees through, 401k matches and things like that. And you interviewed someone who had a criminal record and you thought you'd give them a shot. And the problem becomes you may have identified the right person, the person who really is ready to turn their life around, very engaged and wants to do well. But it's a 50-50 shot whether that person is equipped to succeed. And people with these backgrounds typically come with a lot of gaps in terms of being a viable employee. Some of them are hard gaps. They don't have access to reliable transportation. So one of these employees has a car breakdown, has no money to repair for the car, doesn't know what to do, so just never shows up again, right? That's a possible outcome. Or you have people who've never had mentoring in their life and don't know how to navigate conflict at work and maybe blow up. So you can get a lot of mixed outcomes with that model. What's needed to make this work, and to be clear, this is an investment. This is something that employers have to go at with intention, but it's worth it, is a model which identifies who's truly ready to turn their life around, often in conjunction with a nonprofit partner that's built a relationship, and then needs to understand the gaps, the individual gaps that employee might have, and help them fill those gaps. And that might be referring them to a nonprofit that will help with transportation or housing. That might be a matter of mentoring or coaching that employee has never had in their life. I know a second chance employer in Philadelphia who provides people with alarm clocks because they've never been asked to show up on time every day before. So there's these very basic things that can come up, and it requires a management team, supervisory team that understands, that doesn't condemn, accepts people from where they are, and looks to let them rebuild themselves, and will be surprised by the energy and loyalty that they display.
Yeah, and another big aspect of this, as you were talking, I was thinking of it because my own personal experience, when I first went into the workforce, I worked in a very industrial manufacturing environment. And I actually, like, one of the first things I did was they sent me to work in HR to hire people. And I made the mistake of taking the resumes that had the box checked with felons and put them in the pile to get rid of them. And I took them to the plant manager. My plant manager was like, well, where are the ones with the criminal record? We have some of our best workers. That's where we find them. So that was a quick learning experience for me. And then getting that, personal relationship with people who had been to prison. So I think that one way to overcome the stigma and this cultural stigma that people have of people who've been to prison is by getting more of them into the workforce and
Absolutely.
People getting to know them. So that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this is a cultural issue in many ways. I was fortunate when I was a kid. My dad, who was a man of great achievement, came from very, very poor backgrounds, but never lost touch with his roots. When I was a kid, I would go with him on what he called his errands. It was really an excuse to visit the old neighborhood. And he introduced me to a friend of his who owned a junk shop, basically. And they had a nice chat. And as we walked away, my father mentioned, he was in prison. And I asked for what? And my dad said he was in for murder, a crime of passion. But then my father said something that my dad, who passed away in 2003, said something that's stuck with me forever. He said, he's done his time. And when you bring it down to individuals that you've met and can interact with, it's much easier to say someone's done their time. They deserve this chance to rebuild their lives and join our society.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you can put a face to a story, that is so important. So one more question, Jeff. We talked a little bit about some policies, I think, but anything that from a state or federal level that can be done or needs to be done in order to really, shift this second chance hiring into high gear?
And most of this is governed at the state level. So there's all sorts of disparate policies out there. One of the most productive things, I think, is to take a look at liability reform and giving businesses some safety from negligent hiring liability. Negligent hiring liability, the belief that you take on extra liability hiring someone with a criminal record, is probably overstated. People fear it more than the reality, but it's a barrier. And it's a barrier that doesn't need to be there. And if we can recognize this as such a societal good, we probably could provide more safe harbors for businesses that do that. States like Texas have done this already very successful. That's one that I think is not on the radar screen of most reformers. There are lots of things. Bail reform is good because it stops getting in the way of people being able to keep their jobs. Community supervision, parole, and probation reform is good because, again, it keeps those things can be too heavy-handed and can interfere with people's ability to prosper and thrive, and it's counterproductive. So there are lots of things, but I like to point out the value of negligent hiring liability reform and safe harbors for employers.
All right. Well, I want to give you a chance now to do two things. One, to tell people where they can buy the book, which I think people will know where they can find the book these days. But anything else you want to plug? And if there's anything really important that you wanted to talk about from the book or anything else, please do that now.
And just think for a second if there's anything. They were great questions, and actually kind of interesting, off the beaten track from some of the other questions I've gotten, and very to the point. So I appreciate your experience with this. Okay, well, we'll just. I think I'll just tell where the book can be found and where people can follow me. The book can be found on Amazon and wherever you buy books. I also have links on my website, jeffkorzenik.com. That's KORZENIK.com. Jeff Korzenik. I'm the only Jeff Korzenik on the planet, so I'm easy to find. And if you want to follow my work, I do have a Twitter handle at Jeff Korzenik. As well as I post quite a bit of stuff along these lines on LinkedIn, and would welcome anyone who's interested in following my work.
All right, Jeff. Well, thank you so much for writing this book, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Hope you all enjoyed that interview on Finding Freedom. Another awesome guest. And hopefully you guys also have subscribed to the Lions of Liberty podcast, and you're getting all three of our unique shows in your little listening device delivered to your ears. If you haven't, please do that. Just go to your app, you know how to do it, and subscribe. You can also leave us a 5-star review and a nice comment. We would prefer if you did it on Apple Podcasts, but anywhere you can on the internet, please leave us a positive comment. Also, if you want to support us, we would love that too. Please go to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. You can support us for as little as a couple bucks, or if you get in at a higher level, you get merchandise and access to us, and all the way up to you can advertise on the show or get to even produce a show. So check it all out, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please consider checking out the Lions of Liberty store, where we have some awesome t-shirts. We have a Taxation is Death t-shirt with an awesome design. We have a Wax On, Tax Off t-shirt. And we're always coming up with new ideas and adding new t-shirt designs to the store. Check that out at lionsofliberty.store. And if you're in the Pride, you get a discount on anything you buy in the store. So you do both of those things and you win. That's all I got, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.